Hi, everybody. Welcome to my homestead. Welcome to my channel. My name is Jared. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe. So sometime last year, I came across this website, the American Presidency Project by UC Santa Barbara. And I've been meaning to get back to this. This is a website that's similar to the Scripture Citation Index, which is put together by BYU, that lets you search General Conference talks and the Journal of Discourses and the Scriptures. And you can search for words and phrases. Well, this is like that, but for speeches of presidents of the United States. So it's really, really cool. And I realized that I could use it the same way and see what presidents of the United States have said about the church. And so I'm putting together a new spreadsheet because that's what I do. This one's called Quotes U.S. Presidents. And I'm going to do a study into this because I think that if I collect enough, we might gain some interesting insights. Because that's usually what happens. No matter what the topic is, whenever I do these timelines, we usually learn some really interesting things. So, they have like the little story here about how this website came together. It is not a primary source. They get the speeches from these two places, the presidential papers, messages, and papers of the presidents of the United States by Richardson, and the public papers of the presidents. And these are those two sites. And, this is a government website, and you have to like download the PDF of this like book, and it's like a large file. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go with the American Presidency Project. So just so you know, I usually like to go to the primary source, but I don't put a ton of weight into this little project that I'm doing. But you can go here, you can search terms. I think most of the time I'll have to put in Mormon, but maybe I can find, Latter-day Saints or something like that. And then I have 3 quotes that I want to share that I found. So the first one is from James Buchanan. So some of you already know where we're going with this. This was a State of the Union address in 1857. Very, very interesting. And then I want to contrast this with 2 quotes from President John F. Kennedy, one in 1960 and one in 1963, that just shows a total shift in attitude toward the church. It's like night and day, and it's kind of stunning, really. So let's do this one. This is President James Buchanan, 15th president of not the church, of the United States. He's one of the ones that Wilford Woodruff did not do, did not do proxy work for in the temple. We're going to look at that. So don't worry. If you missed that, you know that President Wilford Woodruff, he had like this vision where the founding fathers asked him to do their work in the temple, and he did the work for them and the signers of the, Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. And then he also did the work for all the presidents of the United States, with the exception of him and Van Buren and Grant, which we're going to get into that in a little bit. But you'll see why that's the case. Okay, so this is the State of the Union address. And I mean, just imagine if this was today. Okay, so it's really long, as they usually are. It's kind of interesting because right before talking about the church in Utah, he addresses Kansas, which is where I live. And they're talking about Kansas being a free or a slave state. That's just an interesting thing to point out. Okay, here we go. A territorial government was established for Utah by act of Congress approved the 9th of September, 1850, and the Constitution and laws of the United States were thereby extended over it. Quote, so far as the same of any provision thereof may be applicable, end quote. Skipping down, Brigham Young was appointed the first governor on the 20th of September, 1850, and has held the office ever since. Whilst Governor Young has been both governor and superintendent of Indian affairs throughout this period, he has been at the same time the head of the church called the Latter-day Saints and professes to govern its members and dispose of their property by direct inspiration and authority from the Almighty. His power has been, therefore, absolute over both church and state. So I have this highlighted because, I'm highlighting a couple things. The things like the arguments that he's making to take action, which is to send the U.S. Army to Utah. And also, as we get further on in orange, you'll see his attitude toward the church. Like, he does not have a very good opinion of the church. So that's in orange. Okay. The people of Utah almost exclusively belong to this church, and believing with the fanatical spirit. Oops, I missed one. Fanatical spirit. So that's his personal views coming through. And believing with a fanatical spirit that he is governor of the territory by divine appointment, they obey his commands as if these were direct revelations from heaven. If, therefore, he chooses that his government shall come into collision with the government of the United States, the members of the Mormon Church will yield implicit obedience to his will. Unfortunately, existing facts leave but little doubt that such is the determination, or is his determination. Without entering upon a minute history of occurrences, it is sufficient to say that all the officers of the United States, judicial and executive, with the single exception of 2 Indian agents, have found it necessary for their own personal safety to withdraw from the territory, and there no longer remains any government in Utah but the despotism of Brigham Young. This being the condition of affairs in the territory, I could not mistake the path of duty. As chief executive magistrate, I was bound to restore the supremacy of the Constitution and laws within its limits. In order to effect this purpose, I appoint a new governor and other federal officers for Utah, and sent with them a military force for their protection and to aid as a posse comitatus, if that's how it's pronounced, in case of need in the execution of the laws. So we all know this story, right? When the United States Army was sent to Utah, there's stories about that. Part of this period of time saw the Mountain Meadows massacre. So this is like the period of time that we're talking about. The President of the United States sending the United States Army to the territory of Utah with a new governor, and worried about, the power of Brigham Young and what and his intentions toward the United States and stuff like that. All right, continuing with the religious opinions of the Mormons, as long as they remained mere opinions, and here we go, however deplorable in themselves and revolting to the moral and religious sentiments of all Christendom, I had no right to interfere. Actions alone, when in violation of the Constitution and laws of the United States, become the legitimate subjects for the jurisdiction of the civil magistrate. My instructions to Governor Cumming have therefore been framed in strict accordance with these principles. At their date, a hope was indulged that no necessity might exist for employing the military in restoring and maintaining the authority of the law. But this hope has now vanished. Governor Young has by proclamation declared his determination to maintain his power by force, and has already committed acts of hostility against the United States. Unless he should retrace his steps, the territory of Utah will be in a state of open rebellion. He has committed these acts of hostility, notwithstanding Major Van Fleet, an officer of the Army, sent to Utah by the commanding general to purchase provisions for the troops, had given him the strongest assurances of the peaceful intentions of the government, in that the troops would only be employed as a posse comitatus when called on by the civil authority to aid in the execution of the laws. There is reason to believe that Governor Young has long contemplated this result. He knows that the continuance of his despotic power depends upon the exclusion of all settlers from the territory except those who will acknowledge his divine mission and implicitly obey his will. And that in enlightened public opinion, there would soon prostrate institutions at war with the laws of both God and man. Quote, he has therefore for several years, in order to maintain his independence, been industriously employed in collecting and fabricating arms and munitions of war and in disciplining the Mormons for military service, end quote. As superintendent of Indian affairs, he has had an opportunity of tampering with the Indian tribes and exciting their hostile feelings against the United States. This, according to our information, he has accomplished in regard to some of these tribes, while others have remained true to their allegiance and have communicated his intrigues to our Indian agents. He has laid in store a provision for 3 years, which in case of necessity, as he informed Major Van Fleet, he will conceal, quote, and then take to the mountains and bid defiance to all the powers of the government, end quote. A great part, a great part of all this may be idle boasting, but yet no wise government will lightly estimate the efforts which may be inspired by, here it is, such frenzied fanaticism as exists among the Mormons in Utah. This is the first rebellion which has existed in our territories. Now, I have this highlighted in red because that's a really, really interesting statement. He says this is the first rebellion which has existed in our territories. And no, it's not a rebellion. Now, I don't know like every minute detail of this whole thing between Buchanan and Brigham Young and all that stuff, but the Saints were not trying to rebel against the United States. I know that. Now, what's interesting is that this was in 1857. So, relatively speaking, not too long before the Civil War. And we're going to talk about that because I have an interesting quote about the way that the United States treated the church before this time, before the Utah period, all the persecution. You have Governor Boggs with the extermination order and how the Saints were treated, in these different locations. So, and now, Utah with Buchanan, with the way that he thinks about the church and what he's doing with this situation. So this is the first rebellion which has existed in our territories, and humanity itself requires that we should put it down in such a manner that it should be the last. Well, yeah, we'll see about that in just a few years. To trifle with it would be to encourage it, to render it formidable. We ought to go there with such an imposing force as to convince these deluded people that resistance would be vain and thus spare the effusion of blood. We can, in this manner, best convince them that we are their friends, not their enemies. In order to accomplish this object, it will be necessary, according to the estimate of the War Department, to raise 4 additional regiments, and this I earnestly recommend to Congress. At the present moment of depression in the revenues of the country, I'm sorry to be obliged to recommend such a measure, but I feel confident of the support of Congress, cost what it may, in suppressing the insurrection and in restoring and maintaining the sovereignty of the Constitution and laws over the territory of Utah. Okay, so that's the quote. The church, this is under church history topics, under Utah War. In 1856 and 1857, Latter-day Saints in Utah Territory experienced a season of spiritual revival or Reformation, quote unquote, featuring strongly worded preaching against apostasy and outside influences. Feeling threatened by this heightened fervor, non-Latter-day Saints living in the territory voiced their concerns in the popular press. At the same time, federally appointed government officials quarreled with church leaders over public policy, and in 1857, Latter-day Saints in the Legislative Assembly announced to the new President of the United States, James Buchanan, that they would no longer tolerate corrupt appointees. This message and other rumors persuaded Buchanan that an insurrection could break out in Utah, and he sent Alfred Cumming with a large contingent of the federal army called the Utah Expedition as an escort to replace Brigham Young as territorial governor. At least 1,500 soldiers marched westward in the largest and most expensive armed undertaking in the United States during the period between the Mexican-American War and the American Civil War. Buchanan stated that the goal of the armed intervention was to restore and maintain, quote, the sovereignty of the Constitution and laws over the territory of Utah, end quote. He believed that Brigham Young and the Latter-day Saints had usurped that sovereignty. Governor Cumming and other territorial officials were to reestablish federal authority over Utah, a directive the Saints feared could incite persecution on a national scale. It talks a little bit about the Mountain Meadows massacre. You can pause and read that if you want. All right, continuing. As the troops marched toward Utah territory, Brigham Young responded by issuing a declaration of martial law, and Latter-day Saints, male and female, readied themselves for the troops' arrival. The army, led by Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston, reached the northeastern fringes of Utah territory in the fall of 1857 and saw that Latter-day Saint militiamen had scorched the major trading and military installation at Fort Bridger, set grass fires, destroyed supply wagons, and stampeded army animals. The expedition soon established a winter base nearby where Alfred Cumming began his gubernatorial term. The coming of the army upset Latter-day Saint society. Brigham Young called on the Saints to, quote-unquote, move south of main settlements in northern Utah. This proved a harrowing experience for many Saints who packed up their meager belongings and food into wagons. Which, could you imagine just years before having come across the plains to escape persecution and then trying to settle down, having a hard time, taming the land, and then you have this go on. Something that should have stopped by the time that they got to Utah, but still having to deal with this. Buchanan sent peace commissioners in June 1858, and Thomas L. Kane negotiated a peace on behalf of the Latter-day Saints. The Army established a base 40 miles or 65 kilometers southwest of Salt Lake City at Camp Floyd that summer. The permanent presence of new federal officials and thousands of new inhabitants altered the local economy and brought to the Latter-day Saints unwanted social, cultural, and political elements. The Utah War led to the creation of a new federal military district called the Department of Utah, and the largest contingent of the United States Army remained in Utah until the American Civil War broke out. Okay, so first, Thomas L. Kane. We've heard that name before on the channel. You may remember talking about him. This is a picture of him. And the church gives out an award these days called, I think it's called the Thomas L. Kane. Yeah, accepted the Thomas L. Kane Award. So this is Robert Abrams, who was the New York State Attorney General, and he's Jewish. And I've done videos talking about him. He went to Israel with Elders Cook and in Holland, now President Holland, for the rededication of the Orson Hyde Memorial Garden on the Mount of Olives. So he's been a good friend of the church, and he was awarded with this award named after Thomas L. Kane, this general that we were just talking about. He's the one that basically negotiated this peace between the United States and the church in Utah. Now, the Civil War. So it's interesting because I have a spreadsheet called Quotes A through Z. The link for my spreadsheets is in the description box of each video. I say that because I always get emails asking if you can access the spreadsheets. Yes. Get on your desktop or laptop or even your smartphone or tablet. Go to the description box and there's a link for my spreadsheets. Okay. You won't be able to do it if you're on a smart TV. So get on one of those other devices. Okay. So this is on row 551 for war, American Civil War. And I just want to show you a couple things. So first we have Doctrine and Covenants 87 verses 1 through 7. And this is the prophecy of the Civil War that was going to break out. This was during Joseph Smith's lifetime, well before the Civil War broke out. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. You should already be familiar with this, especially if you've been in the church for a while. But after prophesying about the Civil War and where it was going to start, in verse 7 it says that the cry of the saints and of the blood of the saints shall cease to come up into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth, which is a Hebrew word. It's like the Lord of hosts, the Lord of armies, from the earth, to be avenged of their enemies. So essentially, the Civil War, it's like the Lord allowed it to happen as a punishment to the United States for not protecting the saints, for being unjust, for the persecution and the lack of justice. Again, it says that the cry of the saints and of the blood of the saints shall cease to come up into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth from the earth, to be avenged of their enemies. And then we have a quote. This is President Orson Hyde, president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And you can find this in Journal of Discourses, volume 6, pages 368 to 369. And this was also before the Civil War broke out. But let me just read the highlights. Excuse me. So he's talking about the guardian angel of the United States, which he identifies as the angel Moroni. And he says, and this was given during, I have it right here actually. This discourse was given on July 4th. It was a celebration of the 4th of July, July 4th, 1854. So just a few years before the Utah expedition, or Johnston's army, came to Utah. Okay, so this is a few years before that State of the Union address that we just read. But since the prophets have been slain, the saints persecuted, despoiled of their goods, banished from their homes, and no earthly arm to interpose for their rescue, what will be the future destiny of this highly favored country? Skipping down. Just so sure and certain will the guardian angel of these United States fly to a remote distance from their borders, and the anger of the Almighty wax hot against them, and causing them to drink from the cup of bitterness and division in the very dregs, stirred up by the hands of foreign powers, in a manner more cruel and fierce than the enemies of the saints in the day of their greatest distress and anguish. And all this because they laid not to heart the martyrdom of the saints and prophets, avenged not their blood by punishing the murderers, neither succored nor aided the saints after they were despoiled of their goods and homes. Later on, had the United States been as faithful a guardian to the Latter-day Saints as the angel of God has been to them, she would never know dissolution, nor be humbled in dishonor by the decrees of any foreign powers. So I find it interesting. I find it really interesting. President Buchanan worried about a rebellion and then sending this army to put it down, suppressing the insurrection. This is the first rebellion, supposedly, which has existed in our territories. And then after that comes an actual rebellion. The American Civil War, a very deadly and bloody civil war, which ironically came because of this kind of behavior and how the saints had been treated by the government. So it's just interesting how things play out. And then on my spreadsheet called Quotes, Visions, and Visitations, this is where I'm trying to capture every quote or story from a general authority who's had a vision, visitation, dream, near-death experience, or end-of-life experience where they come in contact with heavenly messengers or people on the other side of the veil. And we have this one from President Wilford Woodruff, a vision of George Washington and all the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And when I went to the source material, you have this. This is on Wilford Woodruff papers. This is his journal entry for August 21st, 1877. So he says, Brother McAllister had baptized me for the 100 names. I baptized him for 21, including General Washington and his forefathers and all the presidents of the United States that were not in my list except Buchanan, Van Buren, and Grant. So Buchanan was excluded from having his work done. When I did that video, there were some comments from some of you. Like there's this one from Red Merman that says Buchanan was president during the Mormon War or the Utah War that we're talking about. Van Buren met with Joseph Smith and said he couldn't do anything to compensate for the Missouri losses. And Grant was still alive. So that was the current president at the time that Wilford Woodruff did the work for these presidents of the United States and other forefathers. And then there's a few other quotes that basically back that up. Van Buren allowed the persecution of the saints in Missouri and Illinois. Buchanan sought to destroy what we had built. Grant was still alive. And then Joe Pro 66 says, my understanding, Van Buren, Buchanan are now done, including Missouri Governor Boggs. There's an interesting story behind it. So I'll probably have to look that up sometime. I mean, obviously, yeah, at some point their work would be done. I don't think there's anybody on earth who isn't going to have their work done in the temple. It's just that it wouldn't be valid, of course, if they remain wicked, they don't repent. So yeah, I might have to look that story up sometime. So thank you, 3, for your comments. And now, in stark contrast, let's fast forward to the 60s with President John F. Kennedy, 35th President of the United States. This is speech of Senator John F. Kennedy, Salt Lake City, Utah, Mormon Tabernacle. And this is really interesting. We're probably going to have to go over this one again, but this part caught my eye. He says, I am thinking of Apostle Reed Smoot and those who challenged his right to a seat in the U.S. Senate, charging that he would subordinate the claims of his country to the claims of his church. They did not know or would not hear that the 101st section of the Latter-day Saints Doctrine and Covenants gave a scriptural preeminence to the Constitution and its oaths. So this is really interesting. John F. Kennedy referring to Doctrine and Covenants. Okay, continuing. But fortunately, the forces of reason and tolerance enabled him to take his seat. And in the years that followed, Senator Smoot earned the respect and affection of every senator who had challenged him. He rose to be a dean of the Senate and chairman of its powerful Committee on Finance, and no voice was ever heard to say that he had not been devoted solely to the public good as he saw it. So, John F. Kennedy, as a senator himself, praising, this apostle who was Apostle Reed Smoot, who was a senator. And he pointed to a scripture in the Doctrine and Covenants referring to the Constitution. It's just like you go from Buchanan in those early days of misunderstanding and persecution and stuff like that. You go from that to the 60s and things have changed a lot. It's really interesting. And then finally, I have this one. This is September 27th, 1963. Remarks at the Cheney Stadium in Tacoma. He talks about going out west and visiting these different places, Jackson Hole. And then they also went to Utah. And he says, go as we did last night to the Mormon temple and tabernacle and see built in the most arid part, perhaps not only of the United States, but of the world, a great civilization, a great temple, a great tabernacle. I am impressed by nature and more impressed by man. So just more kind words from President Kennedy. So let me know if you enjoyed this and if you think I should continue with this project. to find other quotes from presidents of the United States. We may come across some pretty interesting things. I'm sure that we will. But I think it's good to review these things and just kind of see the attitude toward the government, toward the church, and how it's changed over time. And maybe there's some really interesting things that have been said that, we're not aware of. So if there are, I'll find them. Okay, that's going to be it for this one. So if you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe, like this video if you liked it, leave your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below. Also make sure to share it, and I'll talk to you guys later.